everybody. How you doing? I wanted to talk today a little bit about a band I grew up hearing, and if you're my age and you're where I'm from or right around there, you will have heard of them, but otherwise you might not have, and that band is the Rockets. The Rockets. Rockets were a Detroit band. They were actually formed in 1972, but I guess they kind of reached the height of however far they got in 1976 when they added this singer that I actually knew some. His name was David Gilbert, and he was from my hometown. I actually played guitar with him a couple times. Would see him around and knew who he was, and would talk to him sometimes. But they were a great Detroit rock and roll band. So I'm from Detroit, and I love Detroit rock and roll, and I'm always trying to explain to people how special Detroit rock and roll was and how that city had its own rock and roll sound, just like it had Motown, but rock and roll that came out of Detroit also, just like you had kind of a West Coast sound with the Grateful Dead, or, really Hendrix, the Mamas and the Papas. There were a lot of great bands that came from the West Coast. You had bands that came from the South, obviously, the Allman Brothers. There were New Orleans bands, and there were sort of New England bands. But Detroit, the Midwest in general had its own sound, I think, kind of a hard driving sound, straightforward, which seems to me to go with sort of the Midwest. I always think guys like Rick Derringer, very American sound. But Detroit had its own rock and roll sound. And the Rockets, I feel like were kind of one of the last of the great Detroit rock and roll bands. And in a way, they kind of came. Their heyday was the late '70s, and I've often thought that they played that old school hard driving party Detroit rock and roll at a time when disco was coming along and fashions were changing, and then before too long MTV came out, and they never really crept up out of the Detroit market. So I lived in Chicago for a while. No one had ever heard of them, and that wasn't all that far away. That was also true of Bob Seger. I saw Bob Seger in 1976 at the Pontiac Silverdome. 80,000 people. Live Bullet had just come out. Beautiful Loser was out, but Night Moves hadn't come out yet. And I went to Chicago that fall, and no one who knew who Bob Seger was. I was like, you're kidding me. They're playing Catmandu and Let It Rock and Beautiful Loser, Traveling Man every 5 seconds on WRIF in Detroit, or WWWW Quad at that time, or WABX. I guess that was another good Detroit station back in those days. And no, they'd never heard of Bob Seger. Now, when Night Moves came out, that changed. But the Rockets never really even got up to there. They were very popular in Detroit for several years. They used to play Pine Knob Music Theater every summer. That was always a big show. And they toured all over warming up for bands. But they were a great rock and roll band. So let me tell you a little bit about the Rockets in case you haven't heard of them. The origins of the Rockets were really Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels, another great Detroit band, Sock It To Me. And I hope you'll watch that song I have, Mitch Ryder Revisited, which is sort of a post-rock, postmodern take on Mitch Ryder. But Mitch Ryder was great, just that hard driving. I feel like kind of blue-collar rock and roll, Devil with the Blue Dress On, Good Golly Miss Molly, just super good stuff. Well, the guitar player and the drummer in Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels, now this would be the guitar player who played that great solo on Jenny, 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 Won't You Come Along With Me, Jenny, Jenny, all that stuff, was Jim McCarty. Now, Jim McCarty actually was for a little while in a band called Cactus with Carmen Apice and Tim Bogarty. So he was around, and I'm Facebook friends with Jim McCarty. He's an awesome guitar player. But the drummer was Johnny B. Badadek. I hope I'm saying that right. He was on a bunch of records. He was on a bunch of other rock records that you would know. I think he played a lot with Dick Wagner, who was another Detroit guitar player at that time, on a lot of studio records. Now, Dick Wagner, he played with Lou Reed, and I think he plays some of that great guitar solo work on Sweet Jane, on the Lou Reed version. I think Dick Wagner played some on Get Your Wings by Aerosmith. He played on a ton of records. He was a really good guitarist. And he played a lot with Alice Cooper, actually, another Detroit band. And by the way, Dick Wagner, last I heard, when he was alive, was teaching in some little music store in Flint, Michigan. There's nothing wrong with teaching in a little music store, but I always thought it was kind of sad how some of these guys end up. And then he died. But this Jim McCarty was a great guitar player, and Johnny B. And in 1972, they formed this rock and roll band called the Rockets. So the Rockets were just a hard rock and roll band. And that Jim McCarty was a good rock and roll guitar player. Now, they did have another slide guitar player for a while, and I thought that was their best period. It was Dennis Roberts. I think he passed away, and he ended up playing a lot of country. But the Rockets were great. Now, in 1976, they kind of kicked around, and there's a lesson here somewhere. In 1976, they added this guy I knew who was named Dave Gilbert. He was from my hometown. He was older than I was, so I'm not trying to present him like he was my best friend, but I did know who he was. I know where he lives. I could drive to his house today. And when he was on the road, his house sitter, I won't say that guy's name anymore, but he had someone sit in his house because he'd be gone for like 2 months at his time. His father was actually deaf, but so you wouldn't see his dad around, although a lot of times he was in the house. But he had a house sitter, and so we used to go over to that house all the time when Dave Gilbert was on the road. So I actually do feel kind of like I know him, but that's Dave Gilbert right there. And he had a great voice, that kind of gravelly rock and roll, hard driving voice. There he is right there. And I'll put some pictures on there. And Jim McCarty, I read an interview he did. He said as soon as they added Gilbert, things changed. There's a lesson there somewhere. Because those guys were kind of doing the singing and it was going okay, but they added a really good looking. I think doesn't think that hurts. But really good guy that looked like a rock and roll singer, and sang great. Just that real raspy. He could scream. And by the way, I'm not going to play any Rockets. I don't want any copyright issues, so I'm not going to play any. But they added that really and just took off in the Detroit market, and just did some great albums. And I've got some of their albums. This is, see the kind of a very blue collar looking band, right? Very Detroit looking. Back when Detroit was, I feel bad about Detroit, but and this was one of their last albums, which was a live album. I think that was recorded at Pine Knob. But, even by that time, they were kind of on their way down. I hate to say it. I saw them once, and they were still huge. But I think if I had seen them a year or two before that, they would have been better. But they were still great and very popular. But they just did a lot of that hard-charging rock and roll, Detroit rock and roll, and with a lot of good rock and roll guitar, good songwriting. I think Jim McCarty wrote a lot of those songs. A couple, if you get a chance, I'm going to link to them. I'm not going to play them, but Turn Up the Radio was always one of my favorite songs they did. And I used to play in a pretty good band, actually, in Detroit, and we always did their song Lucille, which was actually an old Little Richard song, but in Detroit, everybody thought it was a Rocket song. And our singer would sing it a lot like Dave Gilbert, and he'd actually taken lessons from Dave Gilbert. I don't know exactly how he paid him, But anyway, he used to go take lessons from Dave Gilbert, and he learned, Dave Gilbert would teach him how to do that rock and roll scream. I think he used to have to crouch like almost like a catcher and like do all these breathing exercises to get that scream. Uh, but just a great band. Very sad. But like I said, I knew Dave Gilbert, and others knew him a lot better. But he was. The other thing Jim McCarty said is when he came into the band, they started getting successful right away. All these great gigs, started going on tour with major acts, and they also started having all the problems with Dave Gilbert, who liked to party a lot and was often a problem. I heard all kinds of stories. I don't know how many of them are true. I don't want to repeat them too much because he was a good guy, and don't want to speak ill of people when they're not around to defend themselves. But I did hear stuff like he'd get paid $10,000 cash, and he'd owe all these people money. People would be like right there when he got paid to take the money out of his hands. Because he'd owe so much money, and he died of liver disease, which is sad. And he wasn't all that, and he died a long time ago. And he was somewhat older than I am. He'd probably be pushing 70 now, but he died 20 years ago, so he wasn't all that old when he died, and he died of liver disease. And I saw him again. Yeah, he played in a group called Roadhouse, and they were kind of doing cover bands. They were doing like the Doors Roadhouse Blues, or Lucille, old kind of Chuck Berry songs, and they were pretty good. But they were playing in bars, and he did that for a while in the '80s, and then he kind of ended up painting houses and living in a trailer. There's nothing wrong with that, and I think he made an honest living. He was a good guy with a good heart on him, a heart for people, but that's what happened to him. And but anyway, the Rockets were a great band, and I'm going to link to some of their music down there, and I hope you'll check it out. And I hope so. I'd like you to encourage you to listen to the Rockets if you get a chance. They were a really good band. And Jim McCarty's a great guitar player. He still plays around a lot, I think, up in Michigan, the Detroit area, and I think also up there around Traverse City a lot. But another great Detroit rock and roll guitar player was Drew Abbott, who played for Bob Seger, another good one, really good. And he played on Live Bullet. And you want to hear that type of rock and roll guitar I'm talking about? Live Bullet by Bob Seger's got it. Just a really good, straight ahead, hard charging. Lots of those old Chuck Berry riffs, but not done in the '50s way. But they're basically like Chuck Berry licks, but played maybe faster and harder. And maybe it's that the amps are set differently or the band's a little different, but it sounds a little different to you. But it's basically like Chuck Berry type songs, Chuck Berry type licks, and just great rock and roll and Detroit rock and roll. And I hope you'll listen to the Rockets. If you like rock and roll music and American rock and roll, it's very American, it's very Midwestern, and it's very city of Detroit. And it's very rock and roll, and it's right out of the heart of this nation, and it's good music and good songs. Another one that I used to play several of those songs. I mean, talking 40 years ago, but we did "Taking It Back," "Turn Up the Radio," and "Lucille." Those are good songs. Another one they had is "Lost Forever, Left for Dreaming." Just a lot of really good songs. "Sally Can't Dance." They did do some covers. But again, like I said, I think they were kind of, there's a lesson there about timing. I think if Gilbert would have joined the band in '72 instead of '76, we might be telling a different story about them. Because in '76, things were kind of changing, and they were still kind of that old barroom Detroit rock and roll, which is what Bob Seger was. That's what Ted Nugent was. That's what Mitch Ryder was. But in terms of the national market, that old barroom Detroit rock and roll was kind of becoming yesterday's tune, so to speak. So but it's great music. It's great American music, and deserves more respect than I sometimes think it gets. And I always stick up for Detroit. You know, it's gone through some hard times, but some great music came out of that city, white and black, by the way. You know, look at all the great Motown. But there were some great rock and roll bands that came out of that town too. And the Rockets, if you like Mitch Ryder and Bob Seger, or Ted Nugent, he's another one. But if you like Mitch Ryder and Bob Seger, that kind of Detroit rock and roll, you ought to listen to the Rockets because they're right in there, musically speaking, with the best of them. They never quite hit the national market, but just a great example of Detroit rock and roll. Well, you take care. God bless you. I just wanted to share that. Bye.